A police officer, notorious for his racist attitude, blatantly stopped a black woman simply because he suspected she didn't belong in the area. Without any valid reason, he acted decisively and coldly under the curious eyes of passers-by. But what he never expected, the woman was an agent of the Secret Service, tasked with protecting the nation's key figures. When her identity and credentials were revealed, the entire incident spread like wildfire, igniting a wave of outrage across the media. The officer's career crumbled instantly, exposing a series of injustices and dark secrets buried within the system. This story is not just about one individual's quest for justice, but also a powerful warning that discrimination and abuse of power will never be tolerated. With her courage and resilience, she became a symbol for those who stand up to defend truth and fairness. Before diving into this gripping journey, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories of bravery and justice inspire you, don't forget to hit subscribe and join us for more meaningful stories to come. Tomorrow, a special story awaits you that you won't want to miss. Claire Johnson stepped out of an exclusive private club where she had just concluded an important meeting with her colleagues. The night sky was calm, with dim streetlights casting a faint glow on the cobblestone road. Claire, exuding a composed and confident demeanor, adjusted the strap of her leather bag on her shoulder and donned a striking red hat, a piece she always carried with her, symbolizing her late father's memory and the lessons he had imparted. The hat was more than just a fashion accessory. It held profound meaning for Claire. To her, it represented the complexity of thought, the readiness to confront prejudice, and the courage to assert herself in spaces where she was often underestimated. Despite knowing the hat might draw attention, Claire wore it as a silent statement. She would never allow others to define her worth. Nearby, Officer Jake Thompson sat in his patrol car, weary after a long shift. This neighborhood, with its pristine streets and luxurious mansions, always left Jake feeling both envious and uneasy. He didn't feel he belonged here, but he used that as justification to distrust anyone who didn't fit the correct image in his mind. When Jake's gaze landed on Claire's silhouette, his simmering resentment was immediately ignited. Claire crossed the street, heading toward her sleek black sedan, when Jake noticed her red hat. His eyes narrowed, and a sense of provocation swelled within him, uncontrollably. A well-dressed black woman, wearing a hat with an ambiguous message, appeared in this area late at night. It all struck Jake as suspicious. "What's she doing here?" Jake muttered, his gaze full of judgment. In his mind, Claire's presence didn't align with his assumptions about who belonged in this neighborhood. Years of prejudice and personal frustrations led him to immediately conclude that Claire's presence was wrong. Despite having no evidence that she was doing anything unlawful, Jake decided to follow her. Unaware that she had drawn attention, Claire continued walking toward her car. Her mind was occupied with thoughts of work and plans for the next day. However, a sudden discomfort crept in as she noticed the light from a patrol car moving slowly behind her. Claire didn't turn around, but her instincts told her she was being watched. Jake maintained a distance, his eyes fixed on Claire. He felt as if she were challenging his authority and his assumptions about the area. It wasn't just the hat or the way she carried herself. It was Claire's confidence and fearless demeanor that made him feel threatened. In Jake's mind, the order of this neighborhood was being disrupted, and he decided to confront Claire just to prove she didn't belong. But Claire had no idea that Jake's decision would set off a chain of tense events, challenging not only his power but also the system he represented. Claire opened the car door and sat in the driver's seat, trying to dispel the unease creeping in as the patrol car maintained its close distance. She checked the rearview mirror, only to see the dim headlights of the police car illuminating the road behind her. Taking a deep breath, Claire reminded herself to stay calm. Situations like this were not unfamiliar to her, but they were never easy. Jake Thompson turned on the patrol car's lights, and the flashing red and blue immediately lit up the quiet street. Claire realized she couldn't ignore it. She kept her hands on the steering wheel and glanced into the rearview mirror to observe. The officer stepped out, his uniform reflecting the lights. But what caught Claire's attention the most was his cold gaze and the way he approached as if he owned the entire street. "Good evening," Jake said, his tone devoid of any friendliness. "Can you tell me why you're here at this hour?" The first question, instead of focusing on her paperwork or any legitimate reason, instantly made Claire aware of Jake's bias. He didn't ask her about a traffic violation or any suspicious behavior, but instead fixated solely on her presence in the area. "I'm just on my way home," Claire replied, keeping her tone calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" Jake squinted, his eyes lingering on the red hat atop Claire's head. "This isn't exactly a neighborhood where someone like you usually shows up, especially not this late." Though his words weren't direct, their implication was clear. Claire felt the discrimination keenly, yet she maintained her professionalism, refusing to show her irritation. "Someone like me?" Claire asked, her expression neutral. "What do you mean by that?" Jake crossed his arms, deliberately moving closer to her car door. "You know exactly what I mean," he said, his tone laced with insinuation. "Let me see your papers. I need to check them." Claire nodded and slowly reached into the glove compartment to retrieve her vehicle documents and driver's license. She knew full well that any careless movement could be misinterpreted. Handing the papers to Jake, she kept her gaze steady on his face. "Everything's here. If you need any additional information, I'll provide it." Jake took the papers, but instead of reviewing them immediately, he looked at Claire again. "You seem confident," he said mockingly. "Do you even know where you are?" Claire could feel the tension in the air rising. "I know exactly where I am," she replied, "and I don't think my being here should be an issue unless I've broken a law." Jake let out a derisive chuckle, but didn't respond right away. Instead, he examined her documents at an intentionally slow pace, as if to prolong the interaction and apply pressure. After a while, he folded the papers and leaned against her car. "Everything seems to check out," he said, "but I still need you to step out of the car for further inspection." Claire raised an eyebrow slightly, but remained calm. "Further inspection? I don't see any legitimate reason for that. I've already provided all valid paperwork." Jake leaned closer, his face mere inches from her car window. "Are you questioning me?" His voice was low but menacing. "I have the authority to check anyone I find suspicious." Claire felt her breathing grow heavier, but she knew she couldn't lose her composure. "I'm not questioning you," she said. "I'm just asking for the legal basis for this request." Jake straightened up, his hand moving dangerously close to the holster on his belt where his gun rested. "The basis?" he said, his voice dripping with authority. "I call it protecting the community." Jake's words felt less like an explanation and more like a declaration of power, rooted not in law, but in personal prejudice. Claire met his gaze directly, refusing to look away. She knew she was facing a challenge that was not just about legality, but also a confrontation between justice and the abuse of power. Claire stared at Jake, recognizing the escalating tension in his tone and actions. The red and blue lights from the patrol car reflected on his face, highlighting his hardened expression but also revealing an unmistakable sense of instability. Jake stood upright, his gaze fixed on Claire, as though waiting for her to make a mistake. "I need to search your car," Jake said, his tone brooking no argument. Claire frowned, maintaining her calm yet resolute demeanor. "I don't think you have a legal reason to do that. I've provided all my paperwork, and it's clear I've done nothing wrong." Jake smirked, his smile dripping with mockery. "You've done nothing wrong, huh? Then you shouldn't mind me checking, right? Or is there something you're hiding?" Jake's question wasn't a genuine inquiry. It was meant to exert pressure. Claire recognized this immediately. She took a deep breath, striving to keep her voice steady. "I have nothing to hide, but the law protects me from actions like this. You need a warrant to search my car, officer." Jake stepped closer, his hand resting on the belt near his gun. "Are you going to lecture me about the law?" he growled, his gaze challenging. "I'm the one enforcing it here." Meanwhile, near the club's entrance, a security guard was watching quietly from the shadows. He had recognized Claire earlier, knowing she was an important guest at the evening's meeting. Seeing the situation escalated, he decided to turn on his phone's camera and began recording everything. It was a risky move, but he felt it was necessary. Jake looked at Claire again, his eyes betraying his internal conflict over what to do next. He had no legitimate cause, but his wounded pride and deep-seated prejudice had clouded his judgment. Without warning, he yanked open Claire's car door and bent down to peer inside. "Don't touch my car," Claire shouted, her voice sharp, but Jake ignored her. He rummaged through the glove compartment and back seat with an air of indifference, as though searching for something to justify his baseless suspicion. When Jake opened the trunk, he found a slim file neatly stored in a leather case. He picked it up and flipped through the pages, his sharp gaze scanning them. On one of the pages, bold letters stood out. "Internal Police Misconduct Investigation Report." Jake froze, his eyes fixed on the document. Claire noticed the immediate shift in his demeanor. From an aggressive officer attempting to assert his power, he now appeared rattled, as though this discovery posed a direct threat to him. "What the hell is this?" Jake demanded, his voice accusatory. He marched toward Claire, holding the file up. "What are you trying to do, huh? Dig into our business?" Claire held his gaze firmly, unblinking. "That's my document, and you have no right to read it. Hand it back immediately." Her voice was strong but not provocative, a perfect blend of assertiveness and calm. Jake gripped the file tightly as if he wanted to crush it. "Who do you think you are? Some hotshot lawyer, someone special? Don't think your job or these papers will protect you from me." Claire understood. This wasn't just a personal confrontation, but a manifestation of systemic abuse of power. She took a deep breath and said, "If you continue, you'll face the consequences. I'm not afraid of you, officer. I know my rights." From a distance, the security guard continued recording every moment. He knew the footage might become crucial evidence if the situation spiraled out of control. Jake stepped back slightly, but his eyes still burned with rage. "We'll see who faces the consequences," he snarled, his voice brimming with defiance. Claire felt the tension in the air grow heavier, but she knew she had to stand her ground. Jake stepped back a few paces, his eyes never leaving Claire. The file in his hand seemed like a potent weapon he could use to subdue her. Instead of de-escalating the situation, he grabbed the radio from his shoulder, pressed the button, and spoke in a cold tone. "This is Officer Thompson. I need backup at this location. There's a suspicious situation that needs to be addressed." Claire heard every word, and a wave of unease washed over her. Calling for backup wasn't just a way for Jake to gain support. It was also a tactic to overwhelm her both psychologically and with sheer force. "You don't need to call for more officers," Claire said, her voice calm but resolute. I haven't done anything wrong. This is getting out of hand." Jake turned back to her, a mocking smile spreading across his face. "Out of hand? You're not in a position to decide that. I am." Claire was faced with a choice: either back down to reduce the risk of escalation, or stand firm to protect her rights and risk immediate consequences. She knew that if she backed down, it would only embolden Jake to push further, not just with her, but with others in the future. On the other hand, standing her ground meant facing potential repercussions in a situation that could spiral out of control. Meanwhile, the club's security guard, still recording the incident from a distance, sensed the mounting tension. He noticed Jake using his radio and instinctively prepared to step in if necessary. Within minutes, the sound of sirens pierced the quiet street. 2 more patrol cars pulled up nearby, their flashing red and blue lights reflecting off Claire's car windows. 3 additional officers stepped out, their expressions serious as they approached Jake. "Officer Thompson, what's going on here?" asked an older officer whose name tag read Sergeant Harris. Jake stepped forward, his voice tinged with triumph. "This woman is acting suspiciously. I searched and found a file related to internal investigations. I need to ensure she doesn't pose a threat to this neighborhood." Claire remained composed, though each of Jake's words felt like a dagger, intentionally painting a false picture of her. She stepped out of the car to address the officers. "I'm a civil rights attorney," Claire said, her voice clear and firm. "Everything he just said is baseless. I've provided valid documentation and have committed no crime." Jake interrupted, his tone filled with insinuation. "She's been uncooperative and is showing signs of obstructing a law enforcement officer. You'll understand once you see this file." He held up the file as though it were indisputable evidence. Claire felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The other officers seemed influenced by Jake's narrative, and she knew she had to act decisively, either stand her ground to fight for the truth or yield to avoid the situation escalating into violence. "You're hearing a distorted version of the events," Claire said, her eyes meeting Sergeant Harris's. "I demand that my rights be respected. I've done nothing wrong and there's no justification for these actions." Jake stepped forward again, his tone growing colder. "You think you can lecture me about the law? I've been doing this job long enough to know who's trustworthy and who isn't." His words were a blatant attempt to undermine Claire's rights. She realized that if she didn't act, Jake would escalate the situation further. But instead of succumbing to fear, she took a deep breath and stood her ground. "You might think you're in the right," Claire said, her tone sharper now, "but I won't let you overstep the law. Everything you've done tonight will be scrutinized. I promise you that." Her words served as both a warning and a declaration that she wouldn't be easily subdued. As the tension mounted, the security guard decided to step closer, his camera still recording. He knew the video could become irrefutable evidence. Quietly, he sent the footage to a colleague to ensure that, even if he were discovered, the video wouldn't be lost. The situation remained tense, but Claire felt a glimmer of hope that the truth might find its way to the surface. The tension between Claire and Jake escalated further, as Jake continued leveraging the presence of his fellow officers to increase the pressure. His words grew increasingly overt in their threats, no longer hiding his intent to push beyond the limits. "You're not cooperating, and that's why I have to take this further," Jake said, his hand resting on his belt near his gun. "I have every reason to believe you're hiding something." Claire stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. "You're abusing your authority. I'm not hiding anything, and I will not allow you to continue violating my rights or insulting me." Jake clenched his jaw, his face flushed with anger. "You won't allow it?" He let out a cold laugh. "You're not in a position to decide that." As Jake prepared to order another search of the car, the strong headlights of a sleek black SUV swept across the parking lot. The deep rumble of the engine came to a solid halt. The door opened, and Marcus Johnson stepped out, his military uniform gleaming under the patrol lights, every metal on his chest shining like a silent declaration of authority and dignity. Marcus approached with a commanding presence, each step exuding confidence. Everyone around stopped in their tracks, their attention shifting from Claire to the tall, formidable man now on the scene. Even Jake paused momentarily, though he quickly regained his usual defiance. "What's going on here?" Marcus asked, his voice low but brimming with authority. Jake turned to face Marcus. "This is a routine investigation. This woman is acting suspiciously, and I'm just doing my job." Marcus narrowed his eyes, his gaze briefly moving to Claire to ensure she was unharmed. He turned back to Jake, his words deliberate and firm. "This woman is my wife, and she's done nothing wrong. How do you justify your actions?" Jake stepped back slightly, but quickly recovered his defiant stance. "I didn't know who she was," he replied. "But her presence here at this hour, along with suspicious documents, gives me enough reason to act." Marcus took another step closer, the distance between him and Jake now mere inches. Those documents belong to her, and she has every right to possess them. Calling them suspicious is not a justification for abusing your authority. Jake, feeling his credibility slipping, grew more aggressive. "I'm not abusing my authority," he said, his voice louder than before. "I'm ensuring the safety of this neighborhood." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his piercing gaze seeming to see through Jake's pretense. "Safety? Or your personal biases?" A heavy silence fell over the scene. The other officers, including Sergeant Harris, began to realize this was more than a routine traffic stop. They watched quietly, awaiting what would happen next. Jake, now cornered, decided to drop any pretense of politeness. "Listen, I don't care who you are. This is my job, and I won't let anyone interfere." Marcus didn't flinch. "Then you should be very careful, because every action you take from this moment on will be documented and held accountable. I'll make sure of that." At that moment, the club's security guard stepped forward, his phone still recording. Breaking the silence, he announced, "I've captured the entire incident on video. If necessary, I'll provide this footage as evidence." His words struck Jake like a hammer. The other officers exchanged uneasy glances, their doubt in Jake's actions becoming increasingly apparent. Marcus turned to the security guard, nodding in acknowledgement of his courageous action. Then he turned back to Jake. "You claim you're not abusing your authority. So why do you seem so nervous about evidence being used against you?" Jake opened his mouth to respond but couldn't find the right words. His fists clenched at his sides, and for the first time that night, his confidence wavered. Standing beside Marcus, Claire spoke up. "The truth will speak for itself, and I assure you, tonight's events won't end here." Jake stood still for a moment, his sharp eyes fixed on Marcus, but beneath the surface, his anger and wounded pride burned fiercely. To Jake, Marcus's arrival hadn't just undermined the authority he thought he held. It had also left him feeling cornered in front of his colleagues. Marcus, calm with the demeanor of someone accustomed to handling pressure, took another step forward, closing the distance between himself and Jake. "You have the right to request documents and conduct checks if you have a legitimate cause," Marcus said, his tone steady yet firm. "But when you cross the line and violate my wife's rights, you're no longer just doing your job, you're abusing your authority." Jake clenched his jaw, struggling to maintain his composure as his eyes flashed with frustration. "You talk like you know my job. he replied, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "But this isn't your base camp. This is real work, keeping the peace." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his piercing gaze unwavering. Keeping the peace isn't targeting a black woman just because she's somewhere you think she doesn't belong. That's prejudice, not law enforcement. Jake took a step back, not out of fear, but to try to regain control of the situation. He pointed at Marcus, lowering his voice in an attempt to intimidate him. "Listen, I don't care who you are. You don't have the right to interfere. This is police business, not the military's." Marcus, unshaken, responded slowly and deliberately, each word cutting like a blade. "You think I'm just a soldier? I'm a citizen, a husband, and someone who will never stand by and watch an abuse of power harm my family." The air between them grew stifling. The other officers nearby exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions tinged with both concern and apprehension. Jake, sensing that his support was waning, became visibly more agitated. "Enough," Jake said loudly, attempting to reassert dominance over the tense atmosphere. "I don't have time to stand here arguing. I have a job to do." At that moment, the club's security guard stepped out of the shadows, holding up his phone, still recording. "Officer Thompson," he said, his voice calm yet resolute. "I've recorded everything from the moment you stopped her vehicle. If necessary, this video will be provided to her attorney or your superiors." All eyes turned toward the security guard. Jake spun around, his face flushed with anger, the fury now mixed with the fear of exposure. "Who do you think you are, interfering here?" Jake snarled, stepping closer to the guard. "Just a citizen ensuring everything is done by the book," the guard replied, unflinching. "You're welcome to check, but this video has already been backed up. And if you proceed, every action you take will be exposed to the public." Marcus stepped forward, positioning himself beside the guard as though to reinforce the situation. "Hear that, Jake?" Marcus said, his voice razor-sharp. "You're not just dealing with us anymore. Everything you do tonight will be held to the light of justice." Jake stood frozen, his hand trembling slightly as he struggled to maintain his hardened demeanor. But the presence of Marcus, the guard, and the damning video had entirely eroded his position. The other officers, including Sergeant Harris, began to display open doubt. "Officer Thompson," Harris said, his tone serious. "It seems the situation has gone far beyond what was necessary. I think you owe everyone here a clear explanation of your actions." Jake didn't respond immediately. His eyes darted around as if searching for an escape. Finally, his voice quieter, he said, "I was just doing my job." Marcus took one final step forward, his voice low but commanding. "The problem is, your job isn't to oppress, violate, or satisfy your ego. Don't forget, you will be held accountable for what you've done." Jake said nothing further. The atmosphere between them felt like a battle Jake had lost, though he lacked the courage to admit it. The atmosphere in the parking lot remained taut as a string, but when the flashing blue and red lights of another patrol car appeared, all attention immediately shifted. A tall officer with a stern face stepped out of the vehicle, carrying himself like someone well-versed in handling complex situations. It was Sergeant Paul Sanders, Jake's direct superior. Paul surveyed the scene, his gaze moving from Claire to Marcus, and finally landing on Jake. Observing the tension among the officers and the presence of the security guard holding a phone, Paul quickly understood that this situation had spiraled far beyond a routine stop. "Jake," Paul said, his voice deep and commanding, "what's going on here? I received a report that you needed backup, but this doesn't look like an emergency." Jake, still trying to maintain his confidence, stepped forward, his voice louder than usual, as if to mask his unease. "This woman was acting suspiciously, Sergeant. I searched her and discovered documents related to internal police investigations. She refused to cooperate, and I had to act to ensure security." Marcus interrupted, his voice cold yet firm. "Suspiciously? Just because my wife, a black woman, was driving home after a meeting? He's crossed every legal boundary, rifling through her personal property without cause." Paul frowned, his stern gaze fixed on Jake. "Do you have a search warrant?" Jake hesitated, the pause thickening the air with doubt. "No, but I had reasonable grounds to believe." "Reasonable grounds?" Claire interjected, her voice clear and unwavering. "I provided all my documents. Everything he's done has been based on prejudice and an abuse of authority." The security guard stepped forward, holding up his phone. "I recorded everything," he said, his tone calm but resolute. "From the moment Officer Thompson stopped her car to when he searched her belongings without cause. If necessary, this footage will serve as evidence." Paul glanced at the security guard, then turned back to Jake. "Jake, is what they're saying true?" Jake, now feeling cornered, frowned and raised his voice as if to overpower the truth. "She has sensitive documents. How do we know she doesn't intend to use them to jeopardize our force? I'm just doing my job." Claire clenched her hands but kept her voice steady. "Those documents are mine, related to my work as a civil rights attorney. There's nothing illegal about them. If you doubt that, let a superior review them. But you had no right to make that call yourself." Paul raised a hand, signaling for silence. "Jake, I understand that sometimes our job requires decisiveness, but this doesn't look like enforcing the law. It looks like overstepping." Jake refused to back down. He turned to his colleagues, attempting to rally their support. "You all know I'm right. We have to maintain order in this area. If we let people like her do whatever they want, what's next?" A heavy silence fell over the group as the other officers exchanged glances. Jake's attempt to stir up solidarity was met with indifference. Paul took a deep breath, his tone growing firmer. "Jake, I don't know what you're trying to prove, but what I've seen and heard tonight doesn't align with the values we stand for. You've gone too far." Jake turned back to Paul, his face flushed with anger, his eyes blazing. "Sergeant, I won't back down just because of a few accusations. This is how we maintain control." Paul shook his head, disappointment evident in his voice. "Maintaining control doesn't mean violating people's rights. You've crossed a line, Jake, and I'll make sure you're held accountable." Claire, now standing beside Marcus, sensed the power shift. She looked at Jake, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "The truth will come out, and you'll face the consequences, not just for what you've done to me, but for what you represent." Jake clenched his fists, but for the first time that night, he had no response. Sergeant Paul Sanders stood silently for a moment, his stern gaze sweeping over the scene. Claire's testimony, the security guard's video, and Jake's obstinate demeanor left him with no room to ignore the situation any longer. He understood that if he failed to act, the situation could spiral out of control, bringing significant harm to the reputation of the entire police force. "Jake," Sanders said, his voice low but resolute, "I cannot overlook what's happened tonight. You've exceeded your authority and failed to follow the procedure. Effective immediately, you are suspended from duty. Hand over your weapon and badge." Jake spun around, his face flushed red, his eyes blazing with anger. "Sergeant, you can't do this to me. I was doing my job. I did nothing wrong." Sanders ignored Jake's protests and stepped closer, his voice sharper. "I don't need to hear any more excuses. You're suspended. Comply immediately." Jake stepped back, his fists clenched as if struggling to contain his rage. Instead of complying, he grabbed the radio from his shoulder, pressed the button, and spoke decisively. "Request an additional support at my location. We have a situation that needs resolving." Claire raised an eyebrow, sensing the rising tension in the air. Marcus moved closer to her, his eyes locked on Jake, ready to act if the situation turned dangerous. "Jake, what are you doing?" Sanders asked, his tone firmer. "Calling for backup won't change anything. It will only make things worse for you." Jake turned, his eyes filled with defiance. "I'm not letting a minor incident and a few accusations destroy my reputation. I know how to protect myself." At that moment, one of Jake's colleagues, Officer Daniel Price, stepped forward. Daniel, who had been silently observing, now wore a conflicted expression on his face. "Jake," Daniel said, his voice calm but steady, "I supported you because I believed you were doing the right thing. But now, I can't back you anymore." Jake whipped around, his face a mix of surprise and fury. "Daniel, what the hell are you talking about? We're a team. Can't you see I'm trying to protect this area?" Daniel shook his head, his expression grave. "What I see is an officer letting prejudice and anger control his actions. What you're doing tonight isn't law enforcement. It's abuse." Silence fell over the group. The other officers exchanged glances, their hesitation evident. Daniel's words were a blow to Jake's pride, but they also seemed to make him more dangerous. Jake narrowed his eyes, stepping closer to Daniel. "You think you're doing the right thing? You're choosing their side over mine? You're no longer part of my team." Daniel didn't flinch. "If doing the right thing means standing for justice, then yes, I'm on their side." Sanders, recognizing the escalating tension, stepped between Jake and Daniel, raising his hand to intervene. "Enough, Jake. You've done enough damage. Hand over your weapon and badge now, or I'll have no choice but to place you under arrest." Jake looked around, his eyes betraying a sense of defeat. But instead of accepting the outcome, he stepped back, his trembling hand hovering near his gun. The situation had reached a boiling point, where even a small action could spark a catastrophic outcome. Marcus, sensing the imminent danger, took a step forward, his voice strong and commanding. "Jake, stop now. This isn't how you prove yourself. Think carefully before doing something you can't take back." Jake, overwhelmed by the pressure from all sides, finally removed his hand from his weapon. Slowly, he unpinned his badge and unholstered his gun, handing them over to Sanders. The defeat on his face was unmistakable, though the embers of wounded pride still smoldered in his eyes. Sanders nodded and gestured for two officers to escort Jake from the scene. He turned back to Claire and Marcus, his voice serious but conciliatory. "I apologize for what happened. I will ensure that he is held accountable for his actions." Claire, though feeling a sense of relief, maintained her firm tone. "It's not just him. The system allowed this to happen, and that needs to change." Sanders nodded again, his expression contemplative. "I understand, and I will do everything in my power to initiate those changes." The air in the parking lot seemed to freeze as Jake, freshly suspended from duty, stood motionless among his colleagues. His face was flushed red with anger, and his eyes glinted with a wild fury as he glared at Claire and Marcus. In Jake's mind, wounded pride and uncontrollable rage churned together into an explosive surge of emotion. Suddenly, Jake stepped toward Claire, his voice booming like thunder. "You think you've won? Don't think for a second that a lawyer like you can ruin me." Marcus immediately stepped forward, positioning himself in front of Claire, his hand raised in a protective stance. "Jake, stop. You've gone too far." But Jake didn't stop. He lunged forward, his fists clenched, ready to unleash his wrath on anyone who stood in his way. The other officers reacted swiftly to the dangerous situation. Officer Daniel Price, who had just opposed Jake, rushed in alongside Sergeant Sanders to restrain him. Jake struggled violently, trying to break free from their hold. "Let me go," he shouted, his voice cracking with rage. "I was just doing what needed to be done. None of you understand." Sanders held Jake firmly, his eyes filled with both disappointment and anger. "That's enough, Jake. You've dug your own grave. Don't make this any worse." Finally, Jake was forced to the ground, his hands cuffed behind his back. His breathing was labored and sweat glistened on his forehead. Yet instead of falling silent, Jake began to laugh. A bitter, wild laugh. "You think I'm the only one?" Jake said, his voice hoarse but dripping with sarcasm. "I wasn't acting alone. I was following orders from above. Everything I did was to protect our system." Jake's words stunned everyone around him. Claire felt a chill run down her spine. She stepped forward, fixing her gaze on Jake. "What did you just say? Orders from above? Who told you to do this?" Jake sneered, his eyes now filled with defiance. "You think this was all me? This system was built to keep power in our hands. The people above me didn't just know, they encouraged it. They don't care about lawyers or justice, they only care about protecting themselves." Sanders frowned, his voice stern. "Jake, if you know something, you need to speak up now. Who gave you these orders?" Jake lifted his head, a glint of defiance in his eyes. "I'm not saying another word, but you'll see soon enough if you dare to challenge this system." Claire stood still, Jake's words etching themselves into her mind. She realized that tonight's incident wasn't just about Jake. It was about a much larger system, designed to conceal wrongdoing and protect abusers of power. Marcus placed a reassuring hand on Claire's shoulder, his voice low but resolute. "We know what we have to do next. This isn't just about Jake. This is about exposing the entire system." Claire nodded, her eyes shining with determination. "He just gave us a crucial lead, and I won't stop until every person behind this is brought to light." Sanders rose, signaling the other officers to take Jake away. "I'll make sure everything he just said is thoroughly investigated. And Mrs. Johnson, if you need assistance from us, I'll cooperate." Claire met Sanders's gaze, her expression unwavering. "I will ask for assistance, but if I see any signs of a cover-up, I'll bring everything to light, and I won't spare anyone." Sanders nodded, understanding that this case had gone far beyond a personal confrontation. This was now a battle against an entrenched system of power. Claire sat at her desk in her modest but well-equipped home office, the light from her desk lamp reflecting off her determined face. The case file on Jake lay open before her, annotated with detailed notes and excerpts from legal statutes she had added during a long night of research. Marcus entered the room, carrying 2 cups of coffee and placing one in front of her. "Are you ready?" Marcus asked, his deep voice full of support. Claire nodded, her eyes alight with an unshakable resolve. "I'm not just ready. This isn't just about Jake anymore. It's about the entire system that protected him. We need to do more than file complaints." The next day, Claire and Marcus organized a press conference at a local community center. Claire, dressed in a crisp black suit, stood before the microphone, flanked by faces from the community, people who had experienced or witnessed abuses of power but had never had the opportunity to speak out. "The incident involving Officer Jake Thompson is not an isolated event," Claire began, her voice clear and strong. "It is a symptom of a deeper issue, a system, designed to protect abusers of power rather than serve the community. We can no longer remain silent." She went on to detail the events of that night, presenting the security guard's video footage as direct evidence. Claire didn't stop at demanding accountability for Jake. She also called for comprehensive reforms in the police force, including bias training, transparency in internal investigations, and independent oversight of police conduct. The press conference quickly captured the media's attention. Articles and news reports began to surface, recounting Claire's story and exposing Jake's actions. More importantly, they sparked a broader conversation about the urgent need for systemic reform. Not content with just bringing the case to light, Claire and Marcus decided to engage directly with the community. They held speaking engagements at community centers, churches, and schools, sharing their story and listening to the stories of others. One evening, at a community center, an elderly woman stood up after Claire finished speaking. Her voice trembled, but her eyes shone with gratitude. "Thank you, Claire. I've witnessed so much injustice in my life, but never believed I could do anything about it. You've given us hope." The woman's words strengthened Claire's resolve. Each meeting and each story she heard reinforced the understanding that this issue was not hers alone, but belonged to the entire community. Marcus, leveraging his credibility as a military veteran, played a crucial role in expanding the reach of their fight. He engaged with leaders in the armed forces who were equally committed to building a fairer society. "We fought to protect freedom and justice," Marcus said during a meeting with veterans, "but how can we take pride in this country if those values aren't upheld at home?" Marcus's words were met with strong support. Many veterans decided to stand with Claire, offering financial assistance and manpower to amplify the reform movement. Gradually, Claire and Marcus's efforts not only gained media attention, but also put significant pressure on local government. City leaders began considering the establishment of an independent commission to oversee the police force. But Claire knew the battle was far from over. "We've planted the first seeds," she told Marcus one evening, "but to see them grow, we have to keep fighting, no matter the challenges." Marcus placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his voice filled with determination. "And you won't fight alone. I'll always stand by your side." Claire stood before the mirror in her office, adjusting the sleek black suit she had chosen for the day. Today marked the public hearing, an opportunity she couldn't afford to miss to push for the necessary reforms. Marcus entered the room, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. His eyes filled with encouragement. "You've prepared your whole life for this moment," Marcus said, his deep voice steady and confident. "Let them know you're not just speaking for yourself, but for everyone who hasn't had the chance to be heard." Claire nodded, taking a deep breath. "Today, we're going to shake the system," she replied, her voice unwavering. In recent weeks, Claire's story has gained massive attention from the media. The video footage capturing Jake's misconduct had aired on major news networks, sparking widespread outrage within the community. The public outcry pressured local authorities into organizing a public hearing to discuss reforms within the police force. Jake, now in custody awaiting investigation, had become a symbol of abuse of power. But Claire knew the issue went far beyond him. "This is our chance to fix a system that's been broken for far too long," she said during a meeting with her team of lawyers and activists. The city council chamber was packed with lawmakers, journalists, and members of the public. Claire stepped up to the podium, her eyes scanning the crowd. The tension in the room seemed to dissipate as she began to speak. "Esteemed lawmakers and members of the community," she began, her voice clear and commanding. "Today, I stand here not just as a victim of abuse of power. I stand here as a citizen, a wife, and a mother, representing those who haven't had the chance to speak." Claire recounted her ordeal in detail, from Jake's unjustified traffic stop to his threats. She used the security guard's video as direct evidence, underscoring the urgent need for police transparency. "What happened to me is not an isolated incident," she said, her voice resonating through the silent room. "It is the result of a system that enables such misconduct to continue unchecked. To end this, we need profound and lasting change." Claire presented 3 key proposals to the council. 1. Retraining police officers, mandatory courses on implicit bias, communication skills, and humane conflict resolution. 2. Transparency in actions. All officers must be equipped with body cameras, with footage monitored by an independent agency. 3. Establishment of an independent oversight body, a committee including community representatives and legal experts to oversee police conduct and handle complaints. "We don't just need to change how police officers behave," Claire concluded, "but also how they are monitored and held accountable. Only then can we build a truly just system." As Claire spoke, an experienced lawmaker rose from his seat, his expression serious. "Ms. Johnson," he said, his voice deep and commanding, "what you've presented is crucial, but are you prepared to face strong opposition from those who don't want to see this system change?" Claire smiled a confident smile that radiated resolve. "I've faced abuses of power and never backed down. I'm ready to face anyone, as long as it brings justice." Following Claire's speech, the room erupted into extended applause. Many members of the public stood to express their support. Even some lawmakers who had been hesitant began to engage in serious discussions about her proposals. From the corner of the room, Marcus watched Claire with pride in his eyes. He knew that today she had not only influenced individuals, but had begun to transform a part of the system itself. Claire and Marcus returned home late at night. The atmosphere in the car was quiet, but far from stifling. It was a silence of deep reflection, of a couple who had just lived through a long yet profoundly meaningful day. Claire stepped into her office, the light from her desk lamp illuminating the red hat neatly placed on the table. The hat, a symbol of the lessons her father had imparted to her, seemed to beckon her to pause and reflect. She gently picked up the hat, her hand brushing over its worn but enduring fabric. She recalled her father's words when he handed it to her. "Daughter, life will test you to your limits, but if you know you're fighting for what's right, never give up. Stand firm, even if no one stands with you." Those words rang clearer now than ever. The fight she was engaged in was no longer just about her rights. It was about the community, about people who had endured injustice but lacked a voice. Marcus entered the room carrying 2 cups of hot tea. He placed one on the table, looking at Claire with a gaze full of support. "That hat has always made you stronger," he said warmly. Claire smiled, her eyes glinting with determination. "I don't just wear it for my father. I wear it to remind myself that we cannot stay silent in the face of injustice." The two sat together, discussing their next steps. The hearing had been a success, but Claire knew that change wouldn't come from one speech or press conference. She and Marcus would need to keep fighting, building alliances, and facing new challenges. "We won't stop here," Claire said, her voice resolute. "There will be opposition, people clinging to the status quo, but that only strengthens my resolve." Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder and nodded. "We're not fighting alone. The community has seen you rise and they'll stand with you, and so will I, always by your side." That night, Claire sat by the window, gazing at the star-filled sky. The small lights piercing the darkness felt like symbols of hope, tiny, yet unextinguishable. Her story wasn't just about confronting one abusive officer. It was a journey to transform a system, a call for justice and accountability. Claire realized that every step she took, Every battle she won was part of a much larger picture. She placed the red hat on her head, a reminder of the responsibility she bore. "Keep fighting," she whispered to herself. Marcus entered the room and stood beside her. Together, they looked out at the night sky, where the glow of street lights illuminated the darkness. Though the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, they knew they had embarked on a meaningful journey. The story closes with Claire and Marcus standing side by side, a symbol of resilience, courage, and unwavering determination. The hope for a fairer system lived not only in them, but also in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed their journey. Claire and Marcus's story wasn't just a battle against abuse of power. It was an inspiration for all of us to stand up for justice and fairness. Are you ready to speak out against the injustices in your daily life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. If this story resonates with you, please like and share this video to spread its powerful message. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories. Thank you for being a part of this journey.